The ring hit the floorboards of Gertrude Talbot's small infirmary with a sound like a gunshot, and she stared at it for a full 3 seconds before she understood what she was looking at. It was a simple band of silver, rough-hewn and honest, the kind a man made himself in the dead of night when he couldn't sleep, and his hands needed something to do besides reach for a bottle. It had rolled in a perfect circle and come to rest against the toe of her boot, and when she looked up from it, Isaiah Doyle was on one knee in the middle of her examining room, his hat pressed to his chest, his jaw set so hard she could see the muscles working beneath the skin. His dark eyes were fixed on her with an intensity that could have stripped paint from the walls. "Gertrude," he said, and his voice was low and rough and stripped of everything except raw, exposed truth. "I know this is not the manner of proposal a woman deserves. I know I am not the manner of man a woman ought to want. But I am asking you to marry me, and I need an answer before you walk out that door tonight, because I cannot—" He stopped, swallowed, started again. "I cannot let you carry what you saw last Tuesday night to anyone in this town. Not because I am ashamed of it, though God knows I have been. But because once they know, once any of them know, I will have to leave Redemption Creek, and I do not want to leave." He held her gaze with everything he had. "I do not want to leave you." The silence between them was enormous. Outside, the October wind of 1882 was pushing dust down the main street of Redemption Creek, New Mexico territory, rattling the sign above Brennan's General Store, making the lanterns swing. Inside this room that smelled of carbolic soap and dried sage, and the specific loneliness of a woman who had come west alone, there was nothing between them but the truth of what she had witnessed, and the wild, impossible thing he was asking her to do about it. Gertrude Talbot bent down slowly, picked up the silver ring, turned it in her fingers, and felt the whole weight of her 31 years press against her chest. She had not expected any of this. She had not expected him at all. 6 weeks earlier, she had been standing on the platform at the Albuquerque rail station with 3 trunks, a medical bag, and the kind of stubborn determination that only women who had been told repeatedly that they could not do something ever truly developed. She was the newly appointed physician for Redemption Creek, a town of 400 souls baking in the high desert of New Mexico territory, and she had taken the position because no one else had applied, and because the Territorial Medical Board had been desperate enough to approve her credentials despite the fact that she was a woman, which they had noted 3 times in the approval letter as though repetition might change the fact. She was not a mail-order bride. She was not a schoolteacher or a widow seeking refuge. She was Dr. Gertrude Talbot, graduate of the Woman's Medical College of Pennsylvania, class of 1878, and she had spent 3 years working the charity wards of Philadelphia before the smell of coal smoke and the weight of that city's particular brand of slow despair had driven her to answer the advertisement in the Territorial Gazette. The stagecoach from Albuquerque to Redemption Creek took 8 hours, and she spent most of it listening to a rancher named Pete Calloway explain to her that what the town really needed was a proper male doctor, not some Eastern lady who would faint at the sight of a gunshot wound. She listened to him with the patience she had learned in those Philadelphia wards, where dismissal was the first language everyone spoke to her, and she said nothing until he paused for breath, at which point she mentioned, pleasantly, that she had treated 47 gunshot wounds in 3 years, had performed 2 amputations without the patient dying on the table, and had once delivered triplets in a tenement hallway during a February blizzard. Calloway did not speak to her again for the remaining 4 hours of the journey, which she considered an excellent outcome. Redemption Creek came into view just as the sun was beginning to lower itself toward the Sandia Mountains, and her first impression of it was that it looked exactly like what it was, a town that had survived longer than anyone expected it to by sheer stubbornness. The main street was wide and unpaved, the buildings a mix of adobe and rough-cut lumber, and there was a quality to the late afternoon light there, thick and golden and ancient, that made her catch her breath despite herself. Mayor Horace Finch was waiting on the platform with his hat in his hands, and an expression that cycled rapidly through surprise, recalibration, and forced welcome. He was a compact, bird-like man with tremendous mutton-chop whiskers and the look of someone accustomed to making the best of disappointing circumstances. "Dr. Talbot," he said, and only the tiniest pause before the title gave away his hesitation. "Welcome to Redemption Creek. We are very glad you have come." "Thank you, Mayor Finch," she said, offering her hand to shake rather than waiting for him to decide whether to offer his. "I look forward to being useful." He shook it. That small act of reciprocal respect would matter more than either of them knew in the weeks to come. The infirmary was a two-room adobe building on the eastern edge of Main Street, separated from the sheriff's office by a narrow alley that smelled of horses and pinon wood smoke. It had been vacant for 8 months, since old Doc Haverson had died of a stroke while examining a patient, which the townspeople seemed to consider either ironic or reassuring depending on their temperament. It had a good examination room, a small back room with a cot for her own sleeping, a wood stove that drew well, and shelves that needed restocking, which she set about doing on her second morning using the supply account the territorial board had established for her. It was on that second morning that she first saw Isaiah Doyle. She had been walking back from Brennan's general store carrying a crate of supplies when she turned the corner from the alley and walked directly into a wall of dark wool and the solid, immovable fact of a large man's chest. The crate hit the ground, jars rolling, and she might have followed them if two hands had not shot out and caught her by the upper arms with a grip that was firm without being rough. "Beg your pardon, ma'am," the man said, and then he bent down without waiting for her response and began gathering her scattered supplies with swift, efficient movements, his long fingers checking each jar for cracks before placing it back in the crate. She crouched to help him and got her first clear look at his face. He was somewhere in his early to middle 30s, she estimated, with the kind of weathered, honest features that the western sun carved into men who spent their days under it. He had a strong jaw shadowed with several days of dark beard, black hair that curled slightly at the collar, and eyes that were very dark brown, almost black, and careful in the way that eyes were careful when they had learned that looking too openly at things had consequences. He wore a worn canvas duster and a battered hat, and there was nothing about him that marked him as unusual in any way except that when he handed the crate back to her and stood, she noticed that his hands were shaking very slightly. "Not with cold, the morning was already warm. I am Isaiah Doyle," he said. "I work the Cowboy spread south of town. You must be the new physician." "Gertrude Talbot," she said. "Yes." Something moved across his face, too quick to read. "Good," he said, and that was all, and he moved past her down the alley with a deliberate, contained stride, and she stood there with her crate and watched him go and thought, with the clinical detachment she deployed against interesting things, that here was a man carrying a secret that was pressing on him from the inside like water behind a dam. She had seen that pressure before. She knew its shape. She did not think about Isaiah Doyle again for 3 full days, which was how long it took for Redemption Creek to discover that it had opinions about her. The first wave came in the form of Mrs. Abigail Crane, wife of the hardware merchant, who arrived at the infirmary on the 3rd morning with a pronounced limp she had been managing for 2 years, and whom Gertrude diagnosed in 20 minutes with a bone spur, and prescribed a specific supportive shoe insert and a series of exercises. Mrs. Crane left looking cautiously hopeful, and by afternoon had told 4 women at the dry goods store that the new doctor was actually quite competent, which in Redemption Creek was the beginning of a reputation. The second wave was less pleasant. Pete Calloway, whom she had shared the stagecoach with, made a point of standing outside the infirmary door on the 4th day, and telling the 3 men with him that the territorial board had lost its collective mind, and that no decent man would let a woman doctor examine him, which she could hear clearly through the open window, and chose not to respond to, because engaging Calloway on his own terms was like trying to teach a mule to waltz. The third wave was the sheriff, a man named Douglas Hatch, who came in officially on the fifth day with a cut on his forearm from a wire fence and unofficially to look her over. He was 40, direct and much less hostile than she had anticipated, and he sat on her examination table and watched her clean and stitch his wound with an expression of genuine, reevaluating interest. "You have done this before," he said. "I have," she said. "The men in this town are going to be difficult," he said. "Some of them. Most of them will eventually need a physician," she said. "That usually resolves the difficulty." He almost smiled. Doc Haverson's death left a gap. Not just medical, he knew things about people, kept things quiet. A town doctor who can do that is worth more than gold out here. She met his eyes. "I understand discretion, Sheriff." He nodded, and she finished stitching his arm, and when he left he put his hat back on in the doorway and said, "Welcome to Redemption Creek, Dr. Talbot." And this time it meant something different than when Mayor Finch had said it. It was in the second week that she began to understand the town's particular geography of secrets. Redemption Creek sat at the edge of cattle country and was caught in the slow squeeze between the large ranching operations moving in from the east and the small ranchers and homesteaders who had been there longer. There were tensions between Anglo settlers and the Hispanic families who had been in the territory for generations. Tensions that Mayor Finch navigated with visible anxiety, and that Sheriff Hatch kept contained through a combination of quiet authority and strategic blindness. There were tensions between the ranchers and the farmers, and between both of those groups and the small community of formerly enslaved people who had come west after the war seeking land and finding, instead, a different set of hostilities. And underneath all of it, like a river running beneath dry ground, there were individual secrets, the kind that accumulated in places where there was no anonymity, where everyone knew everyone's business, where a man's history followed him like his shadow. She was beginning to learn these things when the Tuesday night in question arrived, and with it the event that changed everything. It was the 14th of October, 1882. She had been in Redemption Creek for 11 days. She had developed in those 11 days the habit of working late. The infirmary was quieter after dark, and she used the evening hours for reading the medical journals that arrived sporadically from the east, updating her patient records, and restocking her supply kit. The town generally settled into a different rhythm after 9 o'clock, the saloon noise from Brennan's on the far end of the street becoming a kind of white noise against which she could think. She had just extinguished her reading lamp and was preparing to retire to her back room when she heard it. It was not a loud sound. That was what caught her attention. In the Wild West, loud sounds were common. Gunshots, shouting, horses, the crash of furniture being used as a weapon. This was different. This was a sound she had heard before in the charity wards of Philadelphia, late at night when the ward was dim and the nurses were elsewhere. It was the sound of a man trying very hard not to cry and failing. It was coming from the alley beside the infirmary. She was at the door in 3 steps, not from curiosity but from clinical instinct, because a man making that sound in a dark alley in a frontier town was either injured or in the kind of distress that could end badly. She opened the back door quietly and stepped into the alley, and the moonlight was bright enough that she saw him immediately. Isaiah Doyle was sitting on the ground with his back against the adobe wall of her infirmary, his knees drawn up, his face buried in his hands. His shoulders were shaking. He was still wearing his canvas duster, still wearing his hat, though it had been pushed back from his face. His horse was tied to the post at the end of the alley, patient and quiet. He did not hear her at first. She stood in the doorway and watched for a moment, and she was not watching out of prurience or calculation. She was watching the way she had learned to watch in those wards, reading the specific quality of a person's distress before approaching so that she could approach correctly. What she saw was grief. Not fresh grief, not the kind that came from a sudden blow. This was old grief that had found a crack and was coming through it, the way water found its way through stone. This was a man who had been holding something down for a very long time and had come to this dark, private alley because he thought no one would see, because he needed, desperately, to put it down for just a moment. She came down the 2 steps from the doorway and sat down on the lower one, close enough that he would hear her if she spoke, but not so close as to be an intrusion. "I am not going to ask what is wrong," she said quietly. "You do not have to explain yourself to me." He flinched as though struck, his head coming up, and for one terrible second she saw his face entirely unguarded, his eyes wet, his expression stripped of every layer of the controlled, careful man she had met in the alley 6 days before. He looked simultaneously younger and far, far older. He looked like a man who had been carrying a mountain. Then the layers came back one by one, and he drew a breath and started to get to his feet, and she said, "Please do not leave on my account. I am a physician. I have seen men cry before. It does not diminish you in my estimation." He stopped moving. He was half up, one hand against the wall, and he stayed there in that position for a long moment, caught between flight and whatever it was in him that was too tired to run. Then slowly he sat back down. She did not speak again. She sat on her step and he sat on the ground, and the October night wrapped around them both, cold now, the desert cold that came in fast and honest once the sun was down, and somewhere far off a coyote tested the dark with its voice. After perhaps 10 minutes he said, "His name was Benjamin." She waited. "He was my younger brother. He died 4 years ago this week. Every year when October comes around he stopped. I apologize, you do not need to hear this." "You may tell me if you wish," she said, "or you may not. Both choices are equally acceptable to me." He was quiet again. She could see him working through some internal decision, could see the habit of silence warring with whatever need had driven him to this alley tonight. "He was 22, Isaiah said finally, and his voice was rough but controlled. "He came west to find work. I had been out here 3 years already. I was trying to help him get established." A pause. "He was killed on the Black Rock Range north of here. There was a dispute over water rights. The men who killed him were never charged with anything. The law out here," he stopped again. "The law out here looks different depending on who you are." "I understand," she said, and she meant it in every dimension. He looked at her then, really looked at her, the way he had not allowed himself to do in the alley 6 days ago. "Do you?" "I came west from Philadelphia," she said. "I worked in charity wards for 3 years. I know what it looks like when the law is a door that only opens from the inside." Something shifted in his expression. Not relaxation exactly, but the recognition of a person who understood the world in a similar key. "Why are you here?" he asked. "In this town. You could be practicing medicine somewhere easier," she said. "I was going to say somewhere they would appreciate what you are." The unexpected gentleness of that stopped her briefly. "The same reason you are here, I imagine," she said. "Because someone has to be, and I am capable of it." He looked at her for a long time in the moonlight. Then he said very quietly, "Thank you, Dr. Talbot, for not," he gestured vaguely at the air between them. "Think nothing of it," she said, and she meant that too, though they both knew the truth was something more complicated. He stood then, collected his composure and his hat, untied his horse at the end of the alley. Before he mounted he turned and looked at her one more time, and there was something in that look that she filed away in the part of her mind that tracked important things, the part that was not clinical and not rational, and that she generally tried to keep quiet. "Good night, Dr. Talbot," he said. "Good night, Mr. Doyle," she said. He rode south toward the Callaway spread, and she went inside and stood for a long while in her dark examination room before she lit the lamp again. She had not told anyone. Of course she had not. That was not the kind of woman she was, and she had meant what she said about discretion. A man's grief was his own business, and it had nothing to do with the rest of the world unless he chose to share it. But she was a thorough thinker, and in the days that followed, she turned the encounter over in her mind the way she turned diagnostic evidence over, carefully, from multiple angles, without rushing toward a conclusion. What she arrived at was this: Isaiah Doyle was a man of deep feeling who had been required by circumstance, and by the specific demands of being a man in a frontier territory to keep those feelings entirely underground. The grief for his brother was real and old and unresolved. The controlled, careful surface he presented to the world was not false exactly, but it was only one layer of a much more complex person. And something about the fact that she had seen through it, had sat with him in that alley without flinching, and without making it into something it was not, had unsettled him in a way that he was clearly trying to process. She knew this because she started seeing him more often. He came to the infirmary 3 days after the alley encounter with a legitimate reason. A deep cut on his palm from a piece of fence wire, well beyond what he could clean and wrap himself. She stitched it with a neat, tight row of sutures, and he sat on her examination table and watched her work with that careful attention he gave to everything. "How long have you been doing this?" he asked. "Practicing medicine. 7 years if you count my training years. 4 years since I qualified. Do you like it?" The question was simple and genuine, and she found that she wanted to answer it honestly rather than diplomatically. "Yes," she said. "I find it meaningful. The human body is extraordinary. And when I can help it heal, when I can make the difference between someone dying and someone living," she tied off the last suture. "Yes, I like it very much." "You get looked at differently out here," he said. She glanced up at him. "Does that surprise you?" "No," he said. I was saying that I notice it and I think it is wrong." She held his gaze for a moment, testing whether he meant it or whether it was the easy chivalry that men sometimes deployed. His expression was level and direct, and there was no performance in it. "Thank you," she said. He came back 8 days later with a ranch hand named Tomas Reyes, who had caught a bad cough that was moving toward his chest. She examined Reyes, prescribed a course of treatment, and while she was preparing the medicine she was aware of Isaiah standing by the door, watching her with the particular quality of attention that she was beginning to associate specifically with him. Total, unhurried, as though what she was doing was worth the full cost of his focus. Reyes spoke to her in Spanish, which she answered with competent if imperfect Spanish, and she caught the slight shift in Isaiah's expression that told her that surprised him pleasantly. The Philadelphia charity wards had a significant Mexican immigrant population, she explained, after Reyes had left with his medicine and instructions. "I learned enough to be useful." "Do you speak any other languages?" Isaiah asked, and there was something in his voice that was beginning to sound like genuine interest rather than polite conversation. "French, a little Yiddish, enough Navajo to say I am a doctor and ask where it hurts, which I have been told is pronounced incorrectly but is still understood." He looked at her with an expression she could not quite categorize. "You are not what I expected," he said. "What did you expect?" "I am not sure. Someone smaller." She laughed before she could prevent it, which was not something she did readily. The laugh surprised her and surprised him too, and his face did something she had not seen it do before. It opened, just for a moment, the careful control dropping away, and he smiled. It was a full, genuine smile that transformed his face entirely, and she understood in that precise instant that she was in a degree of trouble that her clinical detachment was not going to be able to manage. She looked back at her supply shelf and organized it with more precision than it required. Over the following 2 weeks, she built a picture of Isaiah Doyle from the small truths that accumulated between them, and from what she heard in the town, which was considerable, since the town talked, and since she was becoming, as Sheriff Hatch had suggested Doc Haverson had been, a useful repository for other people's information. He had been in Redemption Creek for 6 years. He had come from Missouri originally, from a family of modest means and strong convictions. His father had been a free black man who had served in the Union Army during the war. His mother had been Irish, a woman of red hair and fierce temper who had, by all accounts, been exactly the right person to have married Isaiah Doyle Sr. Isaiah himself had taken his father's coloring and his mother's stubbornness, which anyone who spent more than 10 minutes with him could see. He worked for Pete Calloway, which Gertrude found interesting given that Calloway's particular brand of difficulty was directed fairly broadly. She mentioned this once obliquely, and Isaiah's expression had gone careful again. "Work is work," he said. "Calloway knows I am the best hand he has got, and he pays accordingly. He does not have to like me to understand that. And you? I do not require being liked," he said. "I require being paid fairly and spoken to without condescension. Calloway manages the former and mostly the latter." "Mostly," she said. "Mostly," he agreed, with a dryness that she recognized as the specific humor of people who had learned to find the absurdity in difficult situations rather than drown in them. What she was also learning, through these conversations and through observation, was that Isaiah Doyle was regarded in Redemption Creek with a kind of complicated respect. The ranch hands who worked under him were loyal to a degree that spoke clearly of his character. Sheriff Hatch mentioned him once as a man whose word meant something. Mrs. Crane, who had become something of a bellwether for Gertrude on matters of local opinion, described him as a man who had come a long way since arriving in the territory and had made himself someone worth knowing, which in Mrs. Crane's assessment system was the highest available praise. What she also heard, less directly, was the shape of the hidden injustice around him. The brother Benjamin's death had not been a secret exactly, but neither had it been spoken about openly. It had been part of the ongoing, grinding reality of what happened to men who looked like Isaiah in a territory where the law was imperfect and justice was more concept than practice. She heard about it in fragments, from different people, in different registers, sympathetically from Tomas Reyes, carefully from Sheriff Hatch, dismissively from Pete Calloway, who mentioned it once to say that Isaiah had better leave well enough alone and not go stirring up old trouble. She had wanted in that moment to say several things to Calloway. She had said none of them. She had been in Redemption Creek for 28 days when she began to understand that what she was feeling about Isaiah Doyle was not clinical interest or professional regard, or even the ordinary friendship that could develop between two people who respected each other's competence. It was something older and less manageable than any of those things, and it had no business being in her examination room or in her careful, constructed life. And she had spent 3 years in Philadelphia being told that a woman who wanted a medical career had to choose between that and the things that women were supposed to want. And she had said she chose medicine and had believed it. What she discovered, on the 28th day in Redemption Creek, on a cool afternoon when Isaiah Doyle appeared at her infirmary door with a bunch of late-blooming desert wildflowers in his hand and an expression of carefully controlled uncertainty on his face, was that she had perhaps not chosen as clearly as she had believed. He offered the flowers with the specific, slightly clumsy formality of a man who was doing something that required courage. "I thought they might improve the room," he said. "Medicinally speaking." She looked at the flowers and then at him and thought, "You have come to this woman who has seen you at your most unguarded and you have brought her flowers from the desert, and you have no idea whether this is welcome, and you are trying very hard not to let any of that show." "Thank you," she said, and took them from him, and put them in the ceramic pitcher on her supply shelf, and when she turned back to face him, she made no effort whatsoever to keep the warmth she felt out of her expression. Something in him seemed to ease. He asked if she had eaten dinner, and she said she had not, and he mentioned that he knew for a fact that Maria Reyes, Tomas's wife, made the finest red chili stew in the territory, and that she had standing open invitation for him and any guests, and Gertrude said that sounded very agreeable. And they walked together to the small adobe house where the Reyes family lived at the edge of town and ate red chili stew and fresh tortillas, while the Reyes children ran around the table, and Tomas argued cheerfully with his oldest son about the correct way to shoe a horse. Walking back afterward in the evening cool, she said, "I have been told that you should leave old trouble alone." She heard him exhale. By Calloway. He mentioned it, he was not specific. "His idea of leaving it alone is convenient," Isaiah said quietly. "His foreman at the time of my brother's death was the man who was there when it happened. That man still rides for Calloway." She was quiet for a moment, weighing what to say. Is there anything that can be done now, legally? The territorial law in 1882, he said, with a flatness that contained worlds, is what it is. She understood what he was not saying. I am sorry, she said. I do not need your sympathy, he said, and then immediately, that came out wrong. I mean it is not a burden I would put on you. Burdens shared are lighter, she said. That is not just a saying, it is medically demonstrable. He stopped walking. They were between the Ray's house and the main street in a stretch of open ground where the grass was thin and dry and the first stars were beginning to show above the mountains. Why do you do that? He said. Do what? Make things easier. Turn them back around so they become manageable. She faced him. Because you deserve someone who does that, she said simply. And because I have found in 11 years of wanting to be a doctor that most of what looks overwhelming becomes manageable when someone is willing to stand alongside it with you. He was looking at her with an expression that she had not seen on him before and could not precisely name. It was not the stripped-open grief she had seen in the alley. It was something different, something that moved through the careful layers of him and changed the temperature of the air between them. Gertrude, he said, and her name in his voice was different from any other version of it she had heard. Isaiah, she said. The mountains were going dark purple in the last light. Somewhere in the direction of the main street, a door opened and closed. The ordinary world continued its business around them, entirely unaware. He reached out and touched her hand, not taking it, just touching the backs of her fingers with his fingertips in a gesture that was question rather than statement. She turned her hand over and he closed his around it, and they stood there in the thinning evening with the desert cooling around them. And she thought that some decisions you made with your whole self, whether you intended to or not. They began to spend time together in the careful, observed way that two people in a small frontier town could manage, which was to say that they were never entirely private but found privacy in plain sight. Walking after supper when the streets were quiet, talking on the bench outside the infirmary, riding out on her day off to the mesa east of town, where she had discovered that the view of the mountains was extraordinary, and where they could talk without the sense of being watched. These rides and conversations were the architecture of something that was being built between them, whether or not either of them called it by its proper name. She learned his particular quality of stillness, the way he went quiet when he was thinking deeply, the way that quietness was not absence but presence. She learned that he read voraciously, whatever he could get his hands on, that he had strong opinions about the water rights laws that were reshaping the territory, that he could fix nearly anything mechanical, that he had a dry, precise sense of humor that emerged in small, sudden flashes. She learned that he had tried twice to get the circumstances of his brother's death formally investigated and had been turned away both times, and that the turning away had left a scar in him that was not bitterness exactly, but was something harder and more complex, a knowledge of the world's limits that he had chosen to live with rather than be destroyed by. She told him things in return. She told him about her years in Philadelphia, about her mother who had told her that the worst thing she could do was to aim lower than her full capacity, about the professor in her second year of medical school who had told all the women that they were welcome to sit in his classes, but that he was not responsible for their wasted education, about the night she had decided to come west, alone, to a town that did not know her and had not asked for her. Why does that take courage? He asked once, genuinely puzzled. You were going somewhere new to do useful work. Because everything I built in Philadelphia, my position, my reputation, what I had earned, I was leaving behind, and there was no guarantee that what I found here would be better. Was it? He said, and his voice had its particular warmth in it that was becoming something she listened for the way you listen for a specific sound in a familiar piece of music. Yes, she said, looking at him. It was considerably better. The moment that changed things from tentative to certain happened on the 1st of November, a Thursday morning, when Pete Calloway's foreman, a man named Garrett Lyle, came into her infirmary with a broken wrist. She had heard his name before. She had placed it carefully in context. She set and splinted his wrist with complete professional competence and spoke to him with the neutral courtesy she extended to all her patients regardless of her private assessment of their character, and he left. An hour later, Isaiah was at her door. He came in and stood in the middle of the examination room and looked at her with an expression that was asking a question he had not yet formed in words. "He was here," Isaiah said. "Yes," she said. "Garrett Lyle." The name in his mouth was a stone. "He came here. He had a broken wrist," she said. "I treated it." Isaiah was quiet. She could see him processing this, sorting through the layers of feeling it provoked. "Did he say anything?" "Nothing relevant to your situation," she said. "He spoke about the wrist, about the ranch, about the coming winter." Isaiah turned and walked to the window and stood there with his back to her, looking out at the main street. She waited. "I know that you have to treat everyone," he said finally. "Yes. I know that is your oath and your work and your character. Yes. It does not make it easy to have him here in your place." She went to stand beside him at the window. "I know," she said quietly. "I am sorry." He turned to look at her. They were close, standing at the window, and the morning light was coming in sideways and sharp, and she could see everything in his face. "Gertrude," he said, "I need to tell you something." "Tell me," she said. "I am not an easy man," he said, and she heard the enormous care he was taking with the words. "I am not unburdened. I carry things that are not fully resolved. I have enemies in this town, and I have grief that comes at me every October without warning, and I have been out here alone for 6 years building something that is mine in a place that did not always want to give it to me." He stopped. "I am not telling you this as a warning. I am telling you because you deserve to know exactly what is in front of you, and because I have been," he paused again. "I have been working up to asking you something, and it is not fair to do that without being entirely honest first." She was very still. "I am asking," he said, "whether you would be willing to let this become what it appears to be becoming." "This," she said. "What is between us?" he said. "I am asking if you want it." She looked at him for a long moment in the November morning light, and thought about the woman she had been in Philadelphia who had chosen medicine over everything else, and thought about whether that choice had been as complete as she had believed, and thought about the fact that what was in front of her was not a choice between medicine and a man, but a choice about whether she was willing to be fully alive in more than one dimension at once. "Yes," she said. "I want it." The relief that moved through him was visible and total, and she had the thought that he had been expecting her to say something else, had been braced for it, and that the yes had reached somewhere in him that had been waiting for it for a long time. He did not kiss her then. He reached out and touched her face, gently, his thumb at her cheekbone, a gesture of such careful tenderness that she felt it in her chest like a struck chord. "Good," he said softly. The weeks that followed were the happiest she had been in a long time, and she recognized this with the clear-eyed honesty that was simply her nature, without qualification or diminishment. She was practicing medicine in a place that needed her. She was building something real here, and she was falling in love with a man who treated her as an equal in every dimension and who was, in his own contained and careful way, falling in love with her. They were discreet because the town was small, and because they were both private people who understood that what was between them was not a performance for anyone else. But discretion was not secrecy, and by mid-November it was understood in Redemption Creek that Dr. Talbot and Isaiah Doyle kept company, which produced a range of reactions from Mrs. Crane's warm approval to Pete Calloway's visible displeasure to Sheriff Hatch's quiet, satisfied nod. And then October came back around in a sense. Not the month, but what the month held. On the 12th of November, word came from a town called Mesa Roja, 30 miles northwest, that a man was asking questions about Isaiah Doyle. A man who said he was a lawyer from Albuquerque. A man who had papers. Isaiah told her about it in the flat, careful tone he used for things that worried him. They were sitting in the infirmary after closing, a lantern burning on the shelf, the October flowers long gone and replaced with dried herbs she used medicinally. "What kind of papers?" she asked. "I do not know yet," he said. The man who told me is not reliable enough for specifics, but a lawyer with papers heading toward Redemption Creek. He stopped. Could be many things, she said. Could be, he said, but his jaw was set. She looked at him carefully. Is there something you have not told me? A pause, a long one. When I was in Missouri, he said, before I came west, I was involved in something. There was a man, a land speculator named Aldous Creed. He was taking land from families who could not afford to defend their titles in court. I interfered with that process. How? I made documents available to a newspaper, he said. Documents that showed the legal methods he was using were fraudulent. He was eventually ruined. He died 2 years ago. But, she said, but his son is not dead, Isaiah said, and his son has been, for the past several years, pursuing the matter in various legal directions. She was quiet, absorbing this. Is there anything in those documents that creates genuine legal exposure for you? Creed's son's argument would be that I obtained the documents unlawfully, he said. Which is true in a technical sense. Whether a territorial court would, he stopped. I do not know. So someone may be coming here to serve you with a legal action. Or worse, he said quietly. Creed's son has the money to pursue things beyond the law if he chooses to. She heard the weight of that. What do you want to do? He looked at her with that direct, dark gaze. I want to stay here, he said. I have built something here. I am not going to run. Good, she said. Then we deal with it when it comes. His expression shifted at the we, the small word carrying its particular freight. We, he said softly. We, she said firmly. The lawyer arrived 3 days later. His name was Prentice Holt, and he was from Albuquerque, expensively dressed, with the smooth, careful manner of a man accustomed to navigating difficult situations with a minimum of personal risk. He came to the infirmary first, not looking for Gertrude, but because he did not know where to start and had been told she was someone who knew the town. She was polite and entirely unhelpful in terms of useful information. He found Isaiah that afternoon at the Cowboy spread. Isaiah came to her that evening, and the news he carried was what she had feared and what she had not let herself name. The papers were not, strictly speaking, a legal action, not yet. They were a proposal. Creed's son wanted money, a specific amount, paid quietly without further trouble. Blackmail, she said flatly. He would not use that word, Isaiah said. He would call it a settlement. What it is, she said, is a trap. He was sitting at her small table, both hands flat on the surface, looking at the middle distance. If I pay, I acknowledge what happened. If I refuse, he takes it to the territorial court, and I spend the next year defending myself in a system that he stopped. That has not historically been kind to you, she said. No, he said. She sat across from him and thought carefully and quickly, the same quality of thought she brought to a diagnostic problem when the patient was in front of her and time was limited. You have kept the original documents, she said. He looked at her. The documents that showed Creed's fraud, she said. You still have them. A pause, yes. Then the issue is not whether you took them, she said. The issue is what they prove. If they prove that Creed was defrauding people, which they do, or they would not have ruined him, then the question is whether a court is more interested in the fraud or in the method by which the fraud was exposed. He was watching her with total attention. In Missouri when was this? 1874, he said. Missouri in 1874. Have any of the families whose land was at stake brought civil action against the Creed estate since Aldous Creed's death? Isaiah blinked. I do not know. That is something to find out, she said. Because if there are ongoing civil actions, the documents may have a protected status, and even if there are not, she stopped, thinking. Is there anyone in Albuquerque, a lawyer, someone with enough standing to advise you properly before you respond to this proposal? There is a man, he said slowly. A solicitor. He helped me once before, but I did not want to make this larger than it had to be. Isaiah, she said. Creed's son has already made it as large as he intends it to be. The question is not the size. The question is whether you respond to it on his terms or your own. He looked at her for a long moment. You are extraordinary, he said quietly. I am practical, she said. Write to the solicitor tonight. Do not respond to Holt until you have counsel. He wrote the letter that night, at her table, in the small pool of lantern light, and she sat across from him restocking her medicine kit, and the ordinary domesticity of it was something she did not examine too closely, because it felt like something she might damage by looking at it directly. He dispatched the letter the following morning and told Holt, through a brief and careful written response, that he required time to obtain legal counsel before responding to any proposal. Holt left Redemption Creek 3 days later, which told them that the proposal was not backed by any immediate legal instrument, which was exactly the kind of information Isaiah's response had been designed to elicit. He was fishing, Sheriff Hatch said, when Isaiah explained the situation to him. Hatch had been brought in because he needed to be, and because he was the kind of sheriff who took a dim view of blackmail regardless of who it was directed at. He wanted to see if you would scare easy and pay up. He does not know who he was dealing with, Gertrude said, from the chair against the wall where she had positioned herself during this conversation, present but not dominating. Hatch looked at her with the expression that was becoming familiar, the one that said he was still revising his estimate of her upward. No, he agreed. He does not. The response from the Albuquerque solicitor came 10 days later, and it was, on balance, better than they had feared. The documents had never been the subject of a formal complaint. The statute of limitations for the specific type of claim Creed's son might bring had certain interpretive ambiguities that a good lawyer could work with. And more usefully, 2 of the families whose land had been at stake were, in fact, party to an ongoing civil action against the Creed estate that had been brought in 1880 and was still unresolved, which gave the documents a potential legal relevance that changed the picture considerably. "It is not certain," Isaiah said, reading the letter to her in the infirmary, "but it means he cannot simply come at me without risk to himself. He was never going to pursue this in court," she said. "He wanted money. You did not give it to him and you showed you had counsel. He will move on to a softer target." She was right. Prentice Holt was not heard from again. The dark past that had traveled all the way from Missouri to threaten what Isaiah was building in New Mexico territory retreated back into the distance where it belonged, defeated not by luck or by violence, but by careful thought, and the decision to respond from strength rather than fear. The night after he received the solicitor's final letter, confirming that Creed's son had withdrawn the proposal, Isaiah came to the infirmary. It was a Thursday evening in late November, and Gertrude was writing patient notes, and when she looked up and saw his face, she knew immediately that the news was good. He told her, and she closed her eyes briefly in a relief she had been carefully not allowing herself to feel for 3 weeks. Then he crossed the room and she stood, and he took her face in his hands, and he kissed her for the first time, and it was not tentative. It was the kiss of a man who had been deciding for a long time and had decided, who knew exactly what he was doing and was doing it with his whole self. She kissed him back with the same clarity and commitment, her hands at his chest, feeling the solid reality of him against her palms. When they separated, he kept his hands on her face and looked at her with an expression that was entirely unguarded in the best possible way. Not the stripped grief she had seen in the alley, but something the opposite of that, something open and luminous. "I have been thinking," he said, his voice low. "About what?" she said, though she thought she knew. "About the future," he said. "About what I want it to look like." "Tell me," she said. "I want you in it," he said. "Not as what we are now, which is whatever we are now, but fully, permanently. I want to build something with you, Gertrude, a life here in this place." She was quiet for a moment. "Isaiah," she said, "I need to tell you something before you say anything more." He waited, his hand still cupping her face. "I am not going to stop practicing medicine," she said. "That is not negotiable. Whatever we build, whatever a life with you looks like, it includes that." "I know," he said, and there was no hesitation in it at all. "Some men would find that I am not some men," he said simply. "I know exactly who you are. It is who you are that I am asking." She covered his hands with hers where they held her face. "Then yes," she said, "I want that future with you." December in Redemption Creek was cold and clear, and the preparations for the Christmas celebrations that the town made each year were underway, with a natural momentum that drew people together in useful ways. Gertrude found herself part of the fabric of the town in ways she had not been in October, a known quantity now, someone whose presence had demonstrated its value. Mrs. Crane organized a community gathering in the church hall on the second Friday of December, and it was there, in the warmth of that gathered crowd, that Gertrude understood that she was no longer simply the doctor. She was one of them, in the complicated, irreducible way that belonging worked in small places, imperfect and genuine and earned. She and Isaiah were not yet formally engaged, though the town had clearly made certain assumptions. She had no objection to those assumptions, but had not been in a hurry to formalize something that already felt certain in all the ways that mattered. And then came the evening that he had first proposed, and the ring on the floor, and his voice asking her for the answer before she could tell anyone what she had seen. She stood in her examination room with the silver ring in her hand, and she looked at the man on one knee in front of her, and she thought about every layer of what he was asking and why. He was afraid, not of her specifically, but of the exposure. If what she had seen in the alley became known, a man of his background in this territory, seen crying in a dark alley, it would not produce the simple, unremarkable sympathy it deserved. It would be weaponized. By Calloway, by others like him, by a world that had always looked for reasons to reduce Isaiah Doyle to something smaller than he was. She understood that. She had understood it since the night it happened. But she also understood something else, that what he was doing right now, proposing to her in this clumsy, urgent, terrified way, was not only about protection. She could see it in his face. The fear was real, but it was not the whole of what was driving him. The whole of it was larger and truer and more terrifying than that. Isaiah, she said. Gertrude, he said. You are aware, she said carefully, that I was not going to tell anyone. A pause, a very long one. I know that, he said, and his voice was quieter now. I know you, I know your character. Then why this, she said. Why tonight, why in this way? He was still on one knee, and she could see the effort it was costing him to hold her gaze. Because October became November, and November became December, and every day I spent with you made it clearer, he said. And I kept finding reasons to wait, kept thinking I needed to prepare something better, to have more to offer you, to be. He stopped. And then I realized that I was afraid, not of asking, of you saying yes. She was very still. Because if you say yes, he said, then it is real. Then I have something that I could lose. And I have been, Gertrude, I have been very careful for a long time not to have things that could be taken away from me. The honesty of that reached her somewhere below thought. And the ring on my floor, she said gently. Something almost like a painful smile crossed his face. I had it in my pocket for 3 weeks, he said. And I came here tonight intending to do this with considerably more dignity. And then I walked in and you were standing at your supply shelf in the lamplight writing in your journal. And you looked up when you heard the door and you smiled at me, and the ring just, I fumbled. I apologize. She looked down at the ring in her hand. It was plain silver, beautifully proportioned, with a small detail at the join that she had not noticed until now, a tiny, precise design that looked like a desert flower. You made this yourself, she said. I am not much for sentiment, he said, but I could not. I did not want to give you something that someone else made. She closed her hand around the ring and looked at him, this man on one knee in her examination room, this man who had come west carrying grief and secrets, and had built something real here through sheer force of character, this man who had sat in a dark alley with his face in his hands, and had not run when she found him there. Get up, she said softly. He stood slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. I was never going to tell anyone, she said. Not because of fear, not because of obligation, because what I saw in that alley was a man in pain who deserved privacy. That was true the night it happened, and it has been true every day since, and it will be true for the rest of my life. He was listening with everything he had. And I am not going to say yes to this proposal because I need to protect you or because I am afraid of what will happen if I say no, she said. I am going to say yes because you are exactly the person I want to build a life with, and I have known that for a while now, and the only thing I was waiting for was you to stop being afraid of the answer. He exhaled, long and slow, and the tension went out of his shoulders and his frame, and what was left was simply Isaiah, unguarded, honest, entirely himself. Yes, he said. Yes, she said, and held out her left hand. He took the ring from her palm and put it on her finger, and his hands were not shaking this time. They were steady and warm and certain. He lifted her hand and pressed his lips to her knuckle, above the ring, and the gesture was tender in a way that made something in her chest ache with the specific, rare sweetness of a thing that was exactly right. "I love you," he said, quietly, against her hand. It was the first time he had said it in those words, and she felt them land with full weight. "I love you," she said back, simply and completely. They stood together in the lamplight of the examination room that smelled of carbolic soap and dried sage, and the wind moved outside, and Redemption Creek continued its business. And inside this small adobe room on the eastern edge of Main Street, something that had been quietly building since one October night in an alley arrived at its full and honest form. They told people the next day, or rather, they walked together down Main Street in the morning and let the ring on Gertrude's hand be seen, which amounted to the same thing. Mrs. Crane found out by 9 in the morning, and had informed most of the women in town by 10. Sheriff Hatch shook Isaiah's hand and said, "Good," with such unmistakable satisfaction that both of them laughed. Mayor Finch was cautiously pleased, the way he was pleased about most things, with visible mental calculations running in the background. Tomas Reyes brought a bottle of mezcal to the infirmary that evening, and the three of them, plus Maria and two of the Reyes children who were supposed to be asleep, celebrated in the warm, unpretentious way of people who knew each other well. Pete Calloway said nothing to Isaiah directly, but his expression when they passed on the street was the expression of a man recalibrating a situation he could not prevent and had decided, for now, not to fight. Gertrude considered this adequate. They were married on the 20th of December, 1882, in the small church at the west end of Redemption Creek. The ceremony was performed by a circuit preacher named Reverend Cobb, who came through the territory every 6 weeks, and who conducted the service with a direct, unhurried dignity that suited both of them. Gertrude wore her best dress, dark blue wool, and Isaiah wore a clean black coat that she had not seen before and that fit him well, and that she later learned he had ordered specially from Albuquerque 6 weeks ago, which told her things about the timing of his intentions that made her smile. Mrs. Crane had organized flowers, winter flowers gathered from the surrounding desert, dried and tied in bundles, and the church smelled of pine and sage and cold air, and the specific quality of accumulated warmth from many gathered bodies. Nearly the whole of Redemption Creek was there, or seemed like it. Tomas Reyes cried quietly during the vows, which Maria noted with fond exasperation. Isaiah said his vows with the same quality of complete certainty that characterized everything he did when he had fully decided on it, and when he got to the part about keeping her and honoring her, he looked at her with his direct, dark eyes, and she understood that for him these were not ceremonial words. They were a statement of fact. She said her own vows, and she did not cry, because she was not, by constitution, a crier, but something in her voice on the word love made his face do the thing it sometimes did when he was moved. A brief, luminous softening there and gone. He kissed her at the end of the ceremony with the whole town watching, and it was brief and proper and private in the way that mattered. Then the celebration began, and the community hall was warm, and Maria Reyes had organized food with the efficiency of a general, and someone had brought a fiddle and a guitar, and the dancing started and did not stop until nearly midnight, and Gertrude Doyle, she thought her new name, and let it settle over her like something that had always fit. just not been worn yet danced with her husband in the middle of the floor and felt, simply and completely happy. The first months of their marriage had the quality of two lives being carefully, thoughtfully interwoven by people who took the project seriously. They were not young and inexperienced. They were both past 30 and had been fully formed people before they found each other, and this meant that the joining required more intentionality and more conversation and produced, because of that, something more solid than most. She kept the infirmary, of course, which had never been in question. Isaiah had taken on additional responsibilities at the Cowboy spread over the winter, having negotiated, with his characteristic directness, a better arrangement with Cowboy that included a percentage of the next season's cattle profits in exchange for Isaiah managing the eastern portion of the range. It was not independence, not yet, but it was movement toward it. They lived in the infirmary initially, she in her back room now with him beside her, which was cramped and which they both knew was temporary. By February, Isaiah had begun building them a house on a plot of land he had purchased on the northern edge of town, a modest beginning but honest ground. He worked on it on evenings and on his days off, and she sometimes went to watch and brought coffee, and they would stand together in the winter cold looking at the half-built walls and talking about what the rooms would hold. "The east room," she said one evening, wrapped in her wool coat, "should have the biggest window, for light." "Your study," he said. It was not a question. "I need somewhere to work in the evenings when there are no patients," she said. "I know," he said, and added the window to his mental plans without discussion. Spring came to New Mexico territory with the particular dramatic swiftness that the desert specialized in. 1 week cold and still, the next week a riot of bloom and warmth, and the overwhelming smell of the landscape reawakening. The house was ready by mid-April, a solid adobe structure with 3 rooms and a covered porch, and the east window she had asked for, and a kitchen that Maria Reyes had helped Gertrude stock with ruthless practicality. Moving in was a modest ceremony, just the two of them and the Reyes family helping carry furniture, but the evening after everyone had gone, when she and Isaiah sat on the covered porch in the April warmth and watched the sun go down over the mountains, felt like a ceremony of a different kind, the ceremony of a life actually beginning. "Tell me something you have not told me yet," she said. He was quiet for a moment, his hand covering hers on the porch rail. "I have been thinking about the land north of the Cowboy spread," he said. "There is a parcel available, water rights included. It is not large, but it is enough." She turned to look at him. "Your own spread." "My own spread," he said. "Eventually, not now. I need another year at least, maybe 2, to have enough to make it worth attempting." "We," she said. He looked at her. "We," he agreed with the same warmth he always brought to that word. "What would you raise?" she asked. "Cattle initially," he said. "But in the long term, horses. I know horses. I know which lines are worth breeding." She thought about this, about the vision of it, about what it would look like in 5 or 10 years. "I think you should do it," she said. "It is a risk," he said. "Everything worth doing is," she said. He looked at her with that expression she had come to know and treasure, the one that said he was seeing her fully and was grateful for what he saw. "You are the best decision I have ever made," he said simply. In June, she told him she was expecting their child. She had suspected it for 3 weeks before she said anything, had run through the clinical evidence with the same systematic thoroughness she brought to any diagnosis, and had arrived at certainty before she brought it to him. She told him on a Sunday afternoon when they were both home and the house was full of summer light, and she watched his face very carefully. The shock was brief. What came after it was enormous and visible. He sat down abruptly at the kitchen table as though his legs had made an executive decision, and he stared at her with an expression that was completely unguarded and contained equal parts wonder and something that looked very much like the feeling of a man discovering, for the first time, that the ground beneath him was entirely solid. "Gertrude," he said. "I am well," she said immediately, reading what he was about to ask. "My own assessment, conducted with full professional objectivity, is that I am in excellent health and there is no reason to anticipate complications." "You examined yourself," he said, with the particular tone he used when something amused and moved him simultaneously. "I am a physician," she said. He stood up and came to her and held her with a careful, encompassing gentleness, and she put her arms around him and felt him breathe, long and slow. "I am," he stopped, started again. "I cannot, I know," she said. "I would not have let myself want this," he said, his voice low against her hair. "Before, I would not have allowed it." "I know," she said again. "Thank you," he said, and she heard everything that word was carrying. The pregnancy was, as she had assessed, uncomplicated. She continued practicing medicine through the fall, adjusting her practice as necessary, and fielding the opinions of the town about whether she should be doing so with the same pleasant, immovable patience with which she fielded most unsolicited opinions. Isaiah neither encouraged her to stop nor worried performatively. He helped where he could and trusted her judgment, and drove her to house calls when the distances were long and insisted on nothing, except that she tell him immediately if anything changed. Their son was born on the 15th of February, 1884, in their adobe house on the northern edge of Redemption Creek, delivered by Gertrude herself with the assistance of Maria Reyes and the steady, present companionship of Isaiah, who sat at her side through the whole labor and held her hand, and did not flinch once. They named him Benjamin Isaiah Doyle, and when Isaiah first held him, Gertrude watched her husband's face go through something that had no clinical name, something private and complete and vast, and she understood that in naming the boy for his lost brother, they had done something that closed a wound and opened something new simultaneously. She did not look away from his face. She had seen him cry once before in the dark, alone, carrying grief he had nowhere to put. This time, in the first light of a February morning in their own home, with their son in his arms, the tears came and went and took with them something that had been held too long. She said nothing. She simply lay in the bed that smelled of their life together and watched the man she loved hold their child and allowed the moment to be exactly what it was. Benjamin Doyle was, from his first days, a serious and observant infant who regarded the world with dark eyes that were clearly his father's, and a stubborn streak that Gertrude recognized from every mirror. He was healthy and strong, and the town adopted him as it had adopted his parents, completely and on its own terms, which were sometimes exasperating and generally warm. Mrs. Crane was his honorary grandmother in the practical sense, frequently present, full of opinions about infant care that Gertrude fielded with more patience than she would have predicted. Maria Reyes was his unofficial aunt, the Reyes children his first playmates. Sheriff Hatch brought him a small carved wooden horse on the day he heard the news, which Gertrude thought was likely the most emotion she would ever see Hatch display. Spring of 1884 brought, along with Benjamin's increasing loudness and mobility, the resolution of several other threads that had been running since the previous year. The civil action in Missouri, involving the Creed estate and the families whose land had been at stake, reached a settlement. The documents that Isaiah had provided to the newspaper in 1874 were formally entered as evidence by the family's attorney, and their role in exposing the fraud was officially acknowledged. The legal risk that had hung over Isaiah, the hidden threat that Creed's son had tried to weaponize into blackmail, evaporated entirely. There would be no legal action, no trap, no forced choice. The dark past was genuinely past. Isaiah heard the news from his Albuquerque solicitor on a Thursday in April and walked directly to the infirmary where Gertrude was examining a patient, waited with Benjamin on the porch until she was finished, and then told her in the flat, controlled voice he used for things that mattered most. She reached up and touched his face, a gesture that echoed the touch he had given her the first time things had shifted between them. "It is done," she said. "It is done," he confirmed. "Good," she said. "Now have you eaten?" He laughed, that full, open laugh that had been appearing more frequently, that had been appearing with increasing ease as the year and the life they had built accumulated around them. She thought she would never get entirely used to it, the way it transformed his face. She hoped she would not. By the summer of 1884, Isaiah had saved enough to make the initial purchase on the northern parcel. The land changed hands on the 1st of July, and it was a modest beginning. 40 acres with water rights, enough grass to run 30 head, and the potential to expand. It was officially the Doyle Ranch, which was named on no document but was what everyone called it almost immediately. He and Gertrude signed the papers together, sitting side by side at the land office desk, both of them holding the pen for a moment before he wrote their names. She felt the significance of it run through her, this ordinary piece of paper that was also an arrival. Isaiah Doyle had come to this territory 6 years earlier carrying grief and a secret, and the kind of careful, contained survival that was not yet living. He had built his way towards something year by year, through work and intelligence, and the refusal to be reduced by a world that had offered him ample opportunity to be. And now there was this. Land in his name, a woman beside him, a son in Maria raise his arms back at the house, and the legitimate, specific, irreducible fact of a life that was entirely his. Gertrude Doyle had come to this territory 2 years earlier with 3 trunks and a medical bag, and the determination of a woman who had been told too many times what she could not do. She had built her practice, earned her place, found that the choosing was not between medicine and love but between smallness and fullness, between the partial life and the whole one. The ranch built slowly and intentionally. By the fall of 1884 they had 30 cattle and 4 horses. By the spring of 1885 they had 60 cattle, and Isaiah had begun the horse breeding operation he had talked about on the porch in their first April. 2 quality mares acquired at considerable expense and effort, a stallion that had cost him more than the acquisition of the land, and the beginning of a careful selective program that he managed with the same systematic attention he brought to everything. The horses were extraordinary animals, and they attracted attention quickly, the way quality attracted attention in places where quality was genuinely useful. By the end of 1885, Isaiah had sold 3 horses to a ranch in the territory to the north, and 2 to a buyer in Albuquerque who wanted them specifically for breeding, and the reputation of Doyle stock was beginning to establish itself. Gertrude continued to practice medicine. Redemption Creek had grown. It was nearly 600 souls now, and her practice had grown with it, which meant she was genuinely busy and genuinely necessary, which was the condition under which she functioned best. She had trained 2 women in basic nursing skills who assisted her with the patient load, a development that Mayor Finch had initially been uncertain about, and that had resolved itself in the face of the obvious practicality. She had written 2 papers for medical journals in the East about treating certain conditions common in frontier territories, papers that had been received with the polite condescension that the Eastern medical establishment reserved for practitioners who were either female or working in the West. And she had sent them again to different journals with calm persistence, and seen the second one accepted in 1885. Isaiah had read the published paper 3 times and kept a copy on the shelf in his study alongside a book about horse bloodlines and a collection of territorial survey maps. In the autumn of 1885, Gertrude told him she was expecting again. "I suspected," he said, which made her laugh. "Did you?" she said. "You said nothing." "You are a physician," he said, with the specific dryness she loved. "I trusted you would tell me when you had confirmed it." The second child was born in the spring of 1886, a girl they named Miriam Rose, after both their mothers. She arrived in early May when the desert was extravagantly blooming, with a constitution that made her brothers seem quiet by comparison. She announced herself loudly and made her opinion of the world clear from the first moments of it, and Isaiah, holding her within the hour, looked at Gertrude with an expression of helpless, complete love that she kept like a photograph in her mind. Benjamin, 2 years old and already displaying the careful, observant temperament that would define him, examined his sister with the gravity of a man assessing important evidence, and then declared, "She is loud," which was accurate and which remained true as she grew. The Doyle family took the shape that it would hold. Gertrude at the infirmary 5 days a week, home in the evenings, riding out to ranch calls when needed. Isaiah building the horse operation with the focused patience of a man who had learned that the best things took time. The children growing into themselves in the specific, surprising ways that children grew. The ranch accumulating itself acre by acre, animal by animal, season by season. Pete Calloway sold up and left the territory in the spring of 1886, which produced in Isaiah a quiet, complex satisfaction that he did not discuss at length and did not need to. His foreman, Garrett Lyle, went with him, and the particular quality of threat that those two had represented in the atmosphere of Redemption Creek dissipated like morning fog. The Calloway land went to auction, and Isaiah bought 12 acres of it that adjoined his own spread, which brought the Doyle Ranch to a total of 52 acres and gave them a stretch of water access that changed the economics of the horse operation considerably. Tomas Reyes came to work for the ranch in the fall of 1886, leaving his position at the old Calloway spread and bringing with him both his considerable skill with horses and his family, which moved into a small house on the northern edge of the Doyle property. This arrangement was entirely appropriate to both parties and produced the result that the Doyle children and the Reyes children grew up together in the way that shaped people permanently. As though the world was naturally full of people worth knowing, who did not need to be like you in order to be with you. Sheriff Hatch retired in 1887 and was replaced by his deputy, a man named Carson who had learned the same quality of steady authority and had none of Hatch's limitations. Hatch remained in Redemption Creek, growing a kitchen garden and playing chess with Reverend Cobb, and coming by the infirmary periodically with new ailments that Gertrude suspected were mostly an excuse for company. She did not say this to him. The town continued to grow and change. New families arrived. The railroad came closer, a spur line that was rumored and then real, and that changed the economics of the territory in ways both good and complicated. The Hispanic families who had been in the territory for generations navigated the changing landscape with the resilience of people who had long practice at being permanent in impermanent circumstances. The small black community on the eastern edge of town built a church of their own in 1887, and Isaiah was one of the people who helped raise the walls, and the church stood as something that had been built by many hands for a people whose belonging was constantly being contested, and that stood anyway. The injustice of the territory did not disappear. Gertrude and Isaiah were both clear-eyed enough to know that it would not disappear in their lifetimes, that the grinding reality of a world that distributed its justice unevenly was not solved by one family's prosperity or one town's better impulses. But they contributed what they could in the specific ways available to them. She threw her medicine, which she gave equally regardless of a patient's ability to pay or the color of their skin, and he threw the deliberate, consistent way he ran his operation and treated the people who worked with him and showed up in the places where showing up mattered. In the summer of 1888, Benjamin turned 4 and asked his father, with the directness of a child who had learned directness from both parents, why some people in the town looked at them with different faces. Isaiah sat with his son on the porch in the summer evening and told him the truth in the language of a 4-year-old, that some people had decided that how a person looked told you things about them, and that this was not true, and that people who believed it were wrong, and that the best response to it was to live in a way that demonstrated its wrongness every day. Benjamin listened with the serious, total attention he brought to important information. "Is that why you built the ranch?" he asked. Isaiah looked at his son for a long moment. "Yes," he said. "Partly yes." Gertrude was in the doorway listening, and when Isaiah looked up and found her eyes, she held his gaze and saw in it everything that could not be said in a child's language, all the layered truth of what it had cost and what it was worth, and she let him see in her eyes the same quality of clear, steady, complete response. They had built something real. in a place that had not always wanted to give it to them, together. On the 5th anniversary of their marriage, December 20th of 1887, Isaiah gave her a letter. Not a store-bought card, a letter written in his careful, precise hand on good paper which he had clearly worked on for some time. It was not long. It said what mattered in the direct, unadorned way that was his nature. He wrote that he had come to this territory without expecting to find what he had found. That the night she had found him in the alley, he had been at the lowest point he had reached in years, and that her presence there, her stillness, her refusal to make him less than he was, had done something to the foundation of how he understood himself. That he had not known it was possible to be known by someone and not be diminished by it. That he tried every day to deserve her in the same way that she had, without ever requiring it, already shown that she deserved him. She read it at the kitchen table in the December morning while he watched her from across the room, and when she looked up her eyes were bright with the particular brightness of someone who had decided, for once, not to be clinical about feeling something. "Come here," she said. He came, and she stood, and they held each other in the morning light of the kitchen they had built together, in the house they had built together, in the life they had built together. And outside their children were being supervised by Maria Reyes, who had arrived at 7 in the morning to give them this time. And outside the ranch stretched north to the mountains, their horses grazing in the winter-brown grass, and Redemption Creek went about its business with its complicated, imperfect, genuine humanity. He said against her hair, 5 years. 5 years, she agreed. The next 5, he said, and the 5 after that, she said. In the spring of 1889, the third Doyle child arrived, another boy, whom they named Thomas for no named reason except that it suited him from the first moment they said it. Thomas arrived with a temperament between Benjamin's gravity and Miriam's noise, curious and sociable, and already within weeks, demonstrating the capacity to organize any gathering of children around whatever activity he had decided upon. Isaiah, holding his third child, said to Gertrude, "We are building an army." "We are building a family," she said. "The distinction may be academic," he said, and she laughed. Their life continued to build itself, season by season, in the layered and specific way that good lives built. The ranch grew to 80 acres by 1890, and the horse operation had become, by any honest assessment, one of the better small operations in the territory. Isaiah's reputation as a man who knew horses was established and solid, and buyers came from distances that had been unimaginable when he had started with 2 mares and a stallion. Gertrude's practice had evolved too. She had trained a young physician who had come to the territory in 1889, a man named Dr. Willis, who had learned, with some initial friction and subsequent genuine respect, that Dr. Talbot Doyle's methods were based in the best current medical science, and that her 11 years of experience had more value than his 3. They worked together now, which meant she could take more time with the patients who needed it, and occasionally take a proper day off, which Isaiah celebrated with visible satisfaction every time it happened. The infirmary had expanded in 1890, a new room added with funds that the town had contributed collectively, and with labor that included Isaiah and Tomas Reyes, and a considerable number of people who showed up because the doctor had shown up for them when it mattered. On the day the new room was completed, Mayor Finch made a small speech in which he referred to Dr. Talbot as the foundation of the town's medical well-being, and Gertrude accepted this gracefully and privately thought of the man on the stagecoach from Albuquerque who had explained to her that what the town really needed was a proper male doctor. She had been in Redemption Creek for 9 years. It was the longest she had lived anywhere since her childhood, and it was home in the full meaning of that word. Not a place you ended up, but a place you had chosen and been chosen by in return. She and Isaiah were in the habit, on Sunday evenings, of sitting on the covered porch of their house when the weather permitted and doing nothing in particular, reading, talking, watching the light change on the mountains, listening to the children being put to bed by Maria, or by whichever of the Ray's children was old enough to manage it. It was the kind of nothing that was actually the entire substance of a life held up to examine itself, and finding that it was good. On a Sunday in October of 1890, 8 years after the night she had found him in the alley, they were sitting on this porch in the warm autumn evening, and the mountains were going gold in the last light, and the children were inside arguing about something that had the steady, comfortable quality of an argument between people who fundamentally loved each other. Isaiah put down his book, A History of the Western Territories, that he had been reading for 3 weeks, and looked at her in the particular way that meant he was going to say something real. "I want to tell you something," he said. "Tell me," she said, setting down her own journal. "I have been thinking about Benjamin," he said, and she knew he meant his brother, not his son. "About what he would have made of all this." She waited. "He would have liked you," Isaiah said. "He was a man who appreciated competence and honesty and the refusal to be diminished. You would have gotten along well." "I think I would have liked him too," she said, "based on what I know of the people who loved him." Isaiah was quiet for a moment. "I have not been to his grave in 4 years," he said. "It is outside of Mesa Roja, north of here. I have not been ready." "Would you like to go?" she said. "I think I am ready now," he said. "Then we will go," she said. "When you want to." He reached over and took her hand the way he had that first evening on the open ground near the Ray's house, and held it in his, and they sat together in the October evening with the mountains going from gold to purple to the deep, soft dark. "I do not cry in alleys any more," he said, with the specific dry quality of someone making a small joke about a large thing. "I know," she said. "You have somewhere to put things now." "Yes," he said. "I do." They went to Benjamin Doyle's grave in November, the 4 of them, she and Isaiah, and the children, who were old enough to understand something of what the day meant, striding north through the high desert in the clear, cold air. The grave was modest and well kept, tended by the small community that had known him, and they stood at it together in the quiet morning, and Isaiah spoke to his brother in the low, private voice of a man delivering a long-overdue report. He told him about the ranch, about the horses, about the house and the town, and the people who had become family in ways that blood did not always produce. He told him about Gertrude, and Gertrude felt her throat tighten, not with grief, but with the overwhelming particular emotion of being truly seen by someone. He told him about the children, introducing them each by name, and Benjamin at 6 stood very straight at his father's side, and Thomas at 1.5 waved at the headstone in the indiscriminate, generous way of small children who had not learned, yet to make distinctions between the living and the dead. Miriam, 3 years old and not inclined to silence, asked the grave directly why it was there, and Isaiah crouched beside her and explained that some people we love go somewhere else and leave this marker so we know they were here. Miriam considered this and said, "Like when the flowers die but you can still smell them." Isaiah looked at his daughter with an expression that contained the kind of love that had no language adequate to it. "Exactly like that," he said. They rode home in the afternoon, the children asleep in the wagon bed, the mountains long and blue in the distance. Gertrude drove the wagon and Isaiah rode beside it on his best horse, a dark bay that moved with the particular easy power of an animal who knew its own quality. She looked at him riding there in the October afternoon, this man who had come west with grief and caution and the long, careful practice of survival, who had built his way toward something real and had let her build it with him, and she thought that the word love was almost too small for what she felt, the way a single window was almost too small to see a whole landscape through. As if he felt her looking, he turned, and their eyes met across the small distance between the wagon and the horse. He smiled at her. That full, open, transforming smile, she smiled back. The wagon rolled south toward Redemption Creek through the high desert afternoon, carrying everything they had made. The sleeping children, the weight of the living and the honored dead, the acres of land behind them and the life ahead, the years they had already spent and the years still coming, the whole accumulation of what it looked like when two people chose each other with their whole selves and built something that could bear the weight of being real. Behind them, the mountains held their ancient position, and the desert held its vast, honest silence, and the town ahead held its 400 and now 600 and growing souls in their complicated, imperfect, genuine humanity. And none of it would ever be easy in the way that easy things were easy, but all of it was theirs, and it was more than enough, and it was good. It was very, very good.